Hello, everyone, and welcome to the role of SEL in enhancing literacy development. We are so excited and thrilled that you are here. My name is J. Helen Perkins, and I am presently serving as a president of the board of directors of the International Literacy Association. I'm also I'm Professor Emerita of Literacy at the University of Memphis in Tennessee. I am a serious advocate along with ILA. I'm a serious advocate for our children, scholars, and their educators. And I'm excited about the partnership that ILA has with CASEL. Thank you for your presence. And as I get ready to introduce Lakeisha Steele, get ready to learn. I've got my pen and my paper ready to take notes because we're ready to learn. We know the significance and the benefit of SEL, and I'm really excited about what they're going to share with us. We have a great program scheduled for this evening, and I wanted to express my gratitude to the folks at CASEL for their partnership and work in helping to put together this webinar with ILA. Now I will hand over the program to CASEL's Vice President of Policy, Ms. Lakeisha Steele. In her role at CASEL, Lakeisha leads the nonpartisan, nonprofit field leaders, federal and state strategy for advancing social and emotional learning in public policy. Thank you so much, CASEL. Thanks, Lakeisha.
Thank you so much, Helen, for the introduction. We are so grateful to ILA for this opportunity to have this really important discussion about the role of social emotional learning and supporting literacy development. We could not be more excited about this conversation, and particularly with this esteemed panel of our nation's most salient researchers. We are so excited for you to get to know them and learn from them this evening. But before we go into introductions, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping notes. We have allotted time in the presentation at the end of the program for Q&A. You can enter any questions that you have into the chat box, and we will answer as many questions as possible. In order to minimize the chat, you can just minimize the chat box so that you have an undistracted view of the presentation this evening. We also wanted to share 5 days after this webinar, you will be able to access the closed caption recording of this event at literacyworldwide.org/digital events. At this time, I have the honor of introducing our esteemed speakers this evening. You are going to hear from Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, who is the Femi and Donna Atella Professor of Humanistic Psychology and a Professor of Education Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Southern California. She is the founding director of the USC Center for Effective Neuroscience, Development, Learning, and Education, or CANDLE. Mary Helen has pioneered novel approaches to the study of social emotional learning and brain development with implications for educational practice and policy. Welcome, Mary Helen. We're so lucky to have you with us this evening. You also have the honor and privilege of hearing from Dr. Carol Lee. Dr. Lee is the Edwina S. Terry Professor Emerita in the School of Education and Social Policy and Learning Sciences, and as well as African American Studies at Northwestern University. She is the president of the National Academy of Education, a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Conference on Language and Literacy. Her career spans 58 years. She has taught high school, community college, primary school before entering her role as a university researcher. She is a founder of 3 African-centered schools in Chicago, spanning a 50-year history. Her research focuses on recruiting students, everyday focuses on recruiting students, everyday cultural knowledge to support literacy and holistic well-being and development. Next, you will hear from Dr. Alessandra Ward. Alessandra is a former elementary teacher and reading specialist who now prepares our future educators to enter the classroom as an assistant professor of education at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. She teaches courses on literacy methods and transformative SEL and supervises field experiences. She is passionate about supporting young readers holistically by integrating literacy instruction with SEL, designing instruction for reading motivation and engagement, and providing culturally responsive and sustaining instruction. I'm so excited and cannot wait for you to hear from our esteemed panel and to learn from them. These are some of my favorite humans and researchers, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. At this time, I am going to provide an overview of what you can expect to learn this evening and what exactly brought CASEL to the work of literacy. For the past 30 years, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, has really worked to make social emotional learning an integral part of students' education through knowledge and resources about high-quality evidence-based SEL. We do this by driving research, informing policy, guiding effective high-quality SEL implementation and practice, as well as convening our state and district networks. Next slide. You all may be familiar with CASEL Social Emotional Learning Framework. At the center of the wheel are the 5 core competencies, and above the wheel are our key environments where our children live and learn. And in order for SEL to be effective, we know that it must be integrated into instruction, into school-wide cultures, into authentic partnerships, as well as aligned with learning opportunities. So we know that decades of research, including the most recent 2023 meta-analysis by Dr. Cipriano out at Yale, tells us that social emotional learning benefits students. We know that social emotional learning has a positive impact on student academic achievement, their mental health, their social emotional skill development, as well as school climate. We also know that surveys confirm that there is broad support for social emotional learning. 93% of parents say SEL is important in school. 83% of our educators say SEL is important to improving academics. 75% of high schoolers say SEL helps them personally. And we know that 92% of employers say that SEL is important as technical skills. And so at CASEL, like everyone on this call, has been concerned about how the pandemic has affected student achievement and well-being. Our concerns continue to grow as we looked at NAEP scores showing significant declines of reading and math achievement. And we began to think more deeply about how the role of social emotional learning can support literacy development and instruction. And we wanted to really begin to explore how the research from the fields of human development, learning sciences, and neurosciences build upon each other to demonstrate that learning environments and instruction must support students' cognitive, social emotional development, and well-being to drive literacy development. We also wanted to look at how the 5 core competencies overlap with reading practices and processes to support literacy development. And we wanted to more deeply explore the interconnectedness between SEL and cognition. And so you all probably have already received this link, but if you haven't, you will receive a link to our brief, The Role of SEL in Improving Literacy Development, and introductory brief by Dr. Carol Lee and Dr. Alessandra Ward, who you'll hear from this evening, as well as we have our Bridging Sciences, which really explores this integrated approach to supporting literacy development. And we had the opportunity of working with Dr. Carol Lee, who led us on this journey, and worked with Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang as well. So we're really excited to really delve into these questions with you all and for you all to learn from our researchers this evening. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to you, Mary Helen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lakeisha. I'm going to share my slides. Can you see okay? Lakeisha, maybe you give me a thumbs up. Yeah. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight and for inviting me to speak. It's really always an honor and a privilege to be able to talk with educators who are actually on the ground working with young people and think with you about how what we're discovering about the nature of brain development, and in fact, it's deeply situated social, emotional, cognitive, cultural shaping is so core to the ways that kids acquire literacy and frankly all of their academic skills. So I called the talk "Solving the Frankenstein Problem" as a kind of way to share that what we're really learning as we study the brain is that the notion that brains have, like, things happen in one hemisphere or the other hemisphere, or that they happen in little parts that that contribute things that is really not how we're understanding how real world brain functioning around real people's sort of thinking and learning and growing in the actual environments in which we as humans live. Our brain development doesn't work that way. It doesn't work like little pieces. It works like these whole interactive networks of systems that are involved always both in the feeling and the regulation of your own bodily self, your own survival in the basic sense, the feeling of your guts, your viscera, your heart pounding of, and on the other side, the experience, the cognition, the stories, the narratives that we bring to the experience of living in a body with a mind. And these things are deeply intertwined with one another, as I'll give you a little glimpse of today. So I start with a painting by my colleague and friend Margaret Lazari, who was the chair of the Fine Arts Department at USC before she retired a few years ago. And Margaret and I met on the bus one day on our way to campus, and we were talking about what we were each working on. And I said, I'm working on the ways in which people, and young people in particular, construct experience. How do we build self? What is the role of our neurobiology in that process? And how, in turn, does our subjective experience of self in a social and cultural environment shape our neurobiology? How are we sort of situated in a living world? And what does that mean for who we are and what we become? And Margaret said she was working on a series of paintings that focused on the kind of blurry bounds and interdependencies and emergent dynamic interrelatedness of the human biology and the social, cultural, and physical worlds around us. And so we collaborated to make this painting. I didn't do much. I gave her the data that are incorporated in the middle of the painting, which in real life is like a 6 by 8 foot vibrant watercolor, right? Which a PowerPoint slide can't do justice to. But if you squint, you see these kind of white squiggles in the middle, which sort of look like, the waves in this ocean scene, or maybe reflections of the clouds. What they actually are is the white matter fiber tracks of one brave volunteer's brain who allowed us to take pictures of her brain in our MRI scanner. And then we peeled off the outside, all of the cortex, the little cells that do the firing, the neurons that do the firing. So we peeled those off the picture, not off the person, okay, just to be clear. And what's left underneath turns out to be among the most dynamic, complex structures biologically that has been ever discovered. So what we're learning is that there are something like billion little tails of salt water that are connecting each neuron to, on average, 200,000 others, sometimes only one other, depending on the position of that neuron, sometimes orders of magnitude more. And what those connections are doing is enabling a whole person with a mind, with a self, with a body, with relationships to emerge from that dynamic interdependence. And what I love about this painting as a starting place for thinking about the emotional and social aspects of literacy development is that Margaret hasn't painted the brain kind of in a bucket in the corner where we can put on our special scientific glasses and study its structure as if it were a thing on its own. What she's done is taken some connectivity of this woman's, biological and cultural and social experiences, the ways that her brain has been sculpted through her lifetime, and in fact by the lifetimes of those who came before her, all the way back to the origins of mammals. And that connectivity of her brain, she's placed in a kind of semi-translucent way into a seascape of life. She has that brain sort of sloshing in an ocean, which is bolstering it and holding it up. She has the warm sunshine shining down on that brain, and she has the little red fish swimming by to represent the spontaneity of its creative ideas. And this is how we're coming to really understand brain development. Our brains do not just sit inside our heads. Our brains are located inside our heads, but are deeply interconnected with the whole interior of our body. And our bodies and our brains and minds are deeply interconnected with the whole of the social context around us, so that we subjectively experience the relationships, the things that happen, the interpretations of those things as meaningful ways in which to learn about the world. And literacy happens in the context of that situatedness. So I'm just going to take you for a moment to some examples of early literacy. These are from my kids, just because I happen to have them. So this is a song or a poem that was written by my little daughter, who's now big, but when she was 6 in kindergarten. You see a picture of her singing to her baby brother, Theodore, whom she calls Teddy. And she says, I won't sing for you, I'll just read. She says, "Oh, Teddy, we love you more than the whole earth size. As the earth spins every day, we love you as much as usual, but sometimes even more, as you make us proud and happy that you're you." So I have a simple question for you. Is this a poem or a song about this little girl's love for her baby brother? Or is this a poem about her budding interest in planetary science? Right? We situate our learning in the experience of being there, which for humans and all animals actually is deeply social. We are situated in the space of relationships, and I would argue that we learn to appreciate academic skills, to leverage them, to use them in our lives. We learn that by co-opting the same systems in the brain that literally allow us to feel relationships, which in turn are the systems of the brain that allow us to monitor and sense the inside of our guts, our viscera, our state of consciousness. Our lived experience of our body being alive, literally, I will show you in a moment in the brain, is the same substrate neurologically. Those are the same places in the brain neurologically that the networks are involved in for learning. We simply do not have social or emotional or cognitive parts of the brain. The entirety of the brain is all of those things, and they are shaped by the culturally relevant ways in which we subjectively experience those things. And so our own thinking is driving our brain development, and our own thinking happens in the context of relationships and social contexts, which have cultural meaning. They're just, from a neurobiological perspective, it's nonsensical to try to think about social things separate from cognitive things. There are cognitive aspects of tasks and social aspects of tasks, and you could focus on and train those specifically. There are emotional emotions that you could sort of focus on, but those emotions are dependent on the way somebody thought, which is why they decided to have that emotion. The thinking and the feeling are really two sides of the same coin neurologically. So here's another kid, very different kid. So this leads me to my next point. Kids are different. Probably you guessed, if you're trying to teach literacy, that that's the case, right? And so here's another kid learning how to read and early literacy. This is our son, Theodore, when he was 5 in kindergarten, right? So he decided one day to write a poem or a card, rather, I should say, for me and my husband. So this is the picture of the outside of the envelope. Mom, Dad, Teddy, smiley faces and stuff, hearts, people floating, like, okay. You notice there's little monster faces in his letters, right? And so I got a call from his kindergarten teacher one day who said to me, you know, Mary Helen, I'm concerned. Teddy told me he can't learn to read because when he tries to read, the letters on the page are jumping around making faces at him. And I thought, okay, all right, let's just give him some time, all right? But then now I've been thinking about it. And of course, what we now know is that when kids learn to read, right, this is a very odd problem for the brain. It's a problem that has no evolutionary precedent in the history of the development of our brain. Language, spoken language, relationships, culture has a strong evolutionary precedent, but phonological decoding has none. So what does the brain do? It tries to grapple and figure out what's the logic here? What could I do to try to make sense of this system? And what you notice when you learn to read is that you have to so-called break the brain's symmetry, right? So when you learn to read, you have to notice that, you know, one of these, which is an M, is a special thing. It is not an upside down one of these, which is a W, right? One of these is a U. It's not a turned sideways one of these, which is a letter C. All of a sudden, for the first time in evolutionary history, the orientation of a piece of information matters for what it is. There's one way in which the brain processes information such that the orientation matters evolutionarily. What is it? Okay. Oops, I'm going to skip it over here. It's a picture of our president. Okay, I had to find a person to put a picture in there, somebody with a nice big smile. All right, there he is. Right. So what do you notice about Biden's face here? When you look at him, his smile, which makes you want to like him, right? He's trying to be approachable, trustworthy, is not straight. It's not even. It goes up on one side more than on the other, right? It turns out that evolutionarily speaking, the brain has learned, and it turns out dogs have also developed this ability because they've co-evolved with humans, have noticed that the brain tends to be lopsided a little bit in its control. We have handedness, right? And what that means for most people is that one side of their brain, typically the left side, is dominant over the other and making your right hand and the right side of your face contract more when you're expressing emotion. What that means is that a spontaneous, trustworthy facial expression should be a little lopsided. So the brain has learned that when you're trying to figure out if you can trust someone, if you should like someone, what their intent is, it does matter whether the smile is this way or this way. So what happens when kids learn to read? They co-opt facial recognition and emotion processing gyri in the brain and repurpose them for phonological decoding. And as kids learn to read, their ability to recognize emotions on faces declines. What does this tell us about the logic of learning to read, or any skill for that matter? We do not have special brain systems that do this and that. We turn brain systems that are doing a lot of things into the things we need them to be by shaping the way in we engage with the content. So what did Teddy do, I would argue? He was feeling that experience of, you know, it's a face, it's a letter, it's a face, it's a letter. So he's like, great, it's both. And he put faces in all his letters. And then he went on to learn to read. I'm happy to tell you now, he's happily in college and not doing that anymore. Okay. Here's the back of the envelope. And this is where Teddy shines, right? What does he have here? I asked him, I said, Ted, you know, what's this? He said, oh, those are instructions for how to open an envelope. Okay. They're color coded. So there's a little box around the point. All right. And blue is where you're going to look. You focus on the pointy part when you want to open it. And I'm going to put a box around it for you. And then you stick your finger underneath and you lift it up and up and up. And that's how you open an envelope. Right? This kid is my little engineer, right? He is not Nora. He is not writing songs. He is making diagrams with instructions for how envelopes work. And that is the point I want to make. The kids come to literacy bringing different kinds of skills, different lived experiences, but all of them bring a kind of agency, a kind of need to use their literary skills to express things they've learned, to share what they've felt, and to make the meaning they want to make of the world. So let's just look quickly in our last few minutes at the brain. Emotions in the brain are automatic. Happily, you don't have to stop and think, increase my blood pressure, lower the blood rate, do that, right? Stop digesting, it's time to run away, there's a dangerous thing. In fact, that all happens for you automatically as soon as you cognitively recognize that this is a scary place or whatever it is you're thinking about. We learn how to feel our reactions so that they make sense. We learn from experience. That means that our brain development is deeply shaped by the subjective experience of being there. Literacy is not a little thing you stick in a corner of your brain and now you got it or you're not. It's the lived way in which you co-opt face processing in order to turn it into M's and U's and whatever, and over time it becomes automatic, but that shapes the kind of brain you have. It actually demonstrably changes how your brain is shaped now. So what do we see? This is my little nephew. Emotional thinking involves brain regions that feel and regulate the body. They construct a sense of self and consciousness, and all of that literacy development, even the basic stuff that I just showed you, is deeply situated in emotions and relationships and wanting to share the meaning you've made with other people. So what does this mean for the brain? Let's just look at a moment. This is a neuroimaging study we did with adults, where we asked adults to reflect on complex civically oriented stories, complex social stories about the world, and ask them, how do you feel about this story? So they're in the MRI scanner and they're pushing in real-time buttons to tell us, this is deeply emotionally motivating to me. I'm deeply moved with thinking about this. I'm very engaged in it. And then there were other stories in which they say, you know, not that interesting. That's fine that this happened, but I don't think it's that interesting. And actually that was on purpose so that we could build a contrast and look at what's different in the brain when people are telling us, I'm really engaged with thinking about this. It's very meaningful content. What happens? We basically get activations in the same brain regions that literally keep you alive. So what do we have? The brain stem. This is right back in the roof of your mouth, above the roof of your mouth. We share this with alligators. It sits between the whole rest of your brain and the spinal cord down at the bottom. Without this, you cannot stay alive. It literally is the conduit of complex neural white matter fiber tracks that is connecting your brain to your face and body and your face and body to your brain. We get systematic activations in these regions, all the way down to the medulla. If you get damage in this system that I'm pointing to here, if you get damage there, you become completely physiologically dysregulated and rapidly die. You forget to breathe, you lose consciousness, and you die. How powerfully does that speak to the role of thinking in leveraging our systems for keeping ourselves alive? When we think in meaningful ways about content, about ideas, about skills, we are leveraging and changing the way in which we are physically surviving in that moment. What else do we have? Anterior insula. These are on both sides of the brain up at the top. Just really quickly, what happens, we've known for 50 years from neurosurgery studies with epilepsy patients, what happens when you poke around in this part of the brain? The person vomits, okay? This is gastromotoric cortex. Literally, you poke there, the person, okay, vomits or gets other kinds of gastromotoric responses, which I won't describe in polite company. What we found is that when people said, oh, I'm really deeply engaged with thinking about this, we get massive activations in the same brain region that when you poke, the person vomits. You're feeling your engagement on the substrate of your own viscera and guts. Gut feelings are alive and well, but we learn what to have gut feelings about. We learn how to experience the world and around us by loving our baby brother, by building envelopes, by trying to learn to read. Our cultural environments give us opportunities, and it's the subjective way we experience those opportunities that teaches us, or gives us the opportunity to learn, I should say, how to feel ourselves in that space, quite literally. So to sum up, literacy development, like all learning and thinking, happens not in a vacuum. It's not separate from the rest of who the person is. Sure, there are aspects of literacy skills that you can specifically focus on. You must learn to phonologically decode. You must learn to represent sounds with squiggly little signs, right? All of that is true. But the real enactment of those things in a child's growth happens in the space of this glowing jack-o'-lantern of meaning making, of experiencing of life. You can follow our work if you're interested at our webpage, which is CANDLE, the Center for Affective Neuroscience, Development, Learning, and Education, candle.usc.edu. You can follow us on X or on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Oh, Dr. Lee, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Great, okay. So I'm honored to follow Mary Helen. Ever since we have met now, I'm constantly pulling her into one kind of activity or another because the connections are so profound. Let's see, make this work. So I'm going to try to cover more than I actually have time to, so I'm going to apologize in advance that I'm going to run through these slides relatively quickly, but we'll make them available. I'm making reference to this volume, Handbook of Cultural Foundations of Learning, is a handbook that Nyla Nazir, myself, Roy P., and Maxine McKinney de Royston have published. And a lot of what the big ideas that we're talking about in terms of human learning and development, from what Mary Helen is talking about, some of which I'll try to briefly address, but I'm referencing it simply because you can download. It's open access, so you can freely download it from Routledge. Part of what I think is so important in terms of what I think is coming out of Mary Helen's argument is this idea that, can I move this? Human learning is an outgrowth of dynamic relationships between evolutionary inherited genetic processes and people's participation in cultural practices. What I think is so essential about this idea is saying, why should we pay attention to social emotional dimensions of how people learn? It's because, as I always say, Mama Nature says, I got rules about what makes all this work, and you can pay attention or not. If you don't pay attention, I don't care. I have viruses. I don't need you, as humans. That these ideas that Mary Helen has talked about are essential about our evolution as a species. The other is this big idea of the way in which our brains are malleable across the life course. And one of the reasons I think this is important for literacy development, so particularly, in the U.S., we have a lot of attention that we're paying to, assessment outcomes and the like, and sometimes sort of make inferences about what we think our capacities or lack of capacities by certain children, but our brains are malleable across the life course. This notion of social relationships within culturally organized practices as driving development means that in the design of instruction, how we organize social relationships between children and teachers, the social relationships within a broader school environment are all going to matter, including kids' social relationships with acts of literacy. the notion that she really, I think, profoundly put forth about the thinking and feeling and perceptions being intimately connected, feelings having to do with the emotional salience that we construct from our experience, and the perceptions that we have of ourself, of others, tasks, and settings, and how these interact in dynamic ways, and that there is a diversity of pathways. There's not one pathway. One of the things that I think is most interesting is the fact that we have such an international audience here today. And so we're not going to give you some script, from a U.S. framework that says you do this and it'll apply across the board. In fact, it wouldn't apply across classrooms within the United States. So these big ideas, one illustration that I love to reference in it is, this is a picture of a young man, Ben Underwood, who became blind at the age of 3 and turned to thinking about sort of malleability on his own. He determined that he could navigate physical spaces by his enhanced ability with the loss of sight, that his touch and his hearing become enhanced, and he could determine what was in front of him and around him. And so he would have like a little walking stick that he would sort of bounce around and determine how he could physically move around in the world. The point of it is that what we might have thought about as having become a handicap really was just, he learned a different way, of managing it. And he had both the evolutionary capacity, to do that kind of navigation, and that it was not adult driven. This was something that he created on his own, just as the exemplars that Mary Helen from her own children. When we talk about the centrality of culture and social relationships and how these are connected to people's sense of identity, and not only in the United States, but certainly in much of the Western world, the construct of race has become very central to how people think about issues of identity. But because race is an artificial, politically inspired construct that has no validity in and of itself, it becomes really kind of complicated. And I might add that although the examples that I'm giving here are largely sort of US focused in one sense, this is true across the world. I've traveled across a great deal of the world, and while we have national boundaries, virtually every nation in the world is ethnically quite diverse, right? So in the United States, differences between Cuban and Puerto Ricans, as opposed to just the straight construct of Latinx, that Vietnamese, depending on when they immigrated, will have very different experiences, in the United States. East Indians don't look like Chinese, Japanese, or Vietnamese. China, we think often, Chinese as some single holistic sense of identity, when there are 52 different ethnic groups in China who speak very different languages and have very different cultural practices, while at the same time, a sense of what it means to be Japanese, and the notion of intersectionality. So in the United States, in terms of historical relationships between people of African descent and original indigenous populations, they're Black Seminoles and Black Navajos, et cetera. So as we're thinking about the question of how do we think about the recruitment of kids' sort of identities, it's important that we have a critical lens for thinking about what that means, and not in sort of simplistic silos. If I use the exemplar people of African descent, in this case, in the United States, with the history of what many of us call the Holocaust of enslavement, that in the city of New York, Wall Street, which most of you will know is sort of the home of capitalism really in the United States, was originally an African burial ground, so that enslaved Africans buried their dead there. The Schomburg Center for Black Culture in New York City worked with the federal government to get this recognized as a sacred space, and they built this beautiful monument to the fact that there were enslaved Africans buried here. They worked with archaeologists from Howard Universities, dug up remains, found, as one would expect, that people were in ill health. But what they hadn't expected is that these enslaved human beings had buried their dead in positions with amulets and markings on the body that said, I'm Igbo, I'm Akan, I'm Yoruba, I'm not a slave, right? And so there is, in this sense of ethnicity, when we're thinking about the role of cultural and that which sort of gets passed on across time and space in terms of belief systems and privileges around social relationships and the like. In this case, we've got exemplars of people of African descent from different parts of the world, all of whom share a lot of deep continuities of values and practices, or what Wade Boykin calls cultural continuities. And this will be the case as you look at how human beings are immigrating across the globe. They're carrying with them, in many cases, practices that move and shift, but also become different. So in the overarching sense here of what we've been trying to argue so far is that, again, perceptions, cognitions, and emotions are always interacting together in very dynamic ways, not prescribed in advance. Perceptions around whether I'm able to do this task, what effort is it going to require to do it? Does this task meaningful to me? Is there a reason for me to have to engage in the work of doing this thing that may be hard? And what's available to me to help me think about this? In terms of cognition, what kind of knowledge and strategies are available to me to wrestle with this task? And why do I think this task? What do I think is the task? And as a consequence, what is it I'm supposed to do? And then a whole range of emotions that we're trying to manage in terms of, can I do this? Is it safe for me to try to do this and like? I'm offering these as guidelines for how we think about designing instruction, in this case around literacy, but it would apply to any subject matter that we think in schools. I also want to just plant the seed to say that what we're trying to do is to plant some seeds of big ideas that those of you who are involved directly in instruction need to use as sort of guiding posts, because the answers to how to address these, certainly in the context of the United States, are not prescribed. You can't buy them. You can't go to some commercial vendor and find, some program that's going to do everything that we're talking about. So we're arguing that robust learning environments position the learner as competent. In order to engage, in order to be willing to put the hard work into learning something, you have to at least imagine the possibility of competence. Anticipating what the sources of vulnerability. Those sources of vulnerability are going to be very different depending upon the age of the child, the neighborhood, the child's personal history and the like. Some of those sources of vulnerability are personal, some of them are family related, some of them are community related. Examine and scaffold the resources the learner bring. What does the learner bring to the task that we're going to ask them to do? In the case of literacy, even though the issue, as Mary Helen has documented, a phonological awareness involves transformations and not natural, if you will, as tasks for the human brain. But the meaning-making process of making sense of text is, and especially text, which I'm going to use as an example as I proceed forward in terms of literature, because one of the other aspects, and Mary Helen can connect me if I'm wrong, is that we do have a disposition to encode experience as narratives. Making public the social good and utility. Why am I doing this? The older kids get, sometimes the more challenging it is to figure out, why am I supposed to be spending time doing this? What does it mean to make problem solving explicit in public? In the case of reading comprehension, I'm not going to have time to go into this in the level of detail I would like because of time, but the process of how we help kids make sense of text. There's little that's publicly available to educators to do this, but you can do it because you yourselves are expert readers. And part of that is trying to deconstruct for yourself or in communities of teachers, what is it that I'm doing to try to make sense such that I can make those processes public and available to my students, to support learners as they're engaged in complex problem solving and to provide, expansive opportunities. So there are a number of sort of fundamental shifts in the area of reading itself. One is the idea of reading as a relational skill. It has to do with relationships between the reader and the text, the reader and the task, etc. In terms of how the difficulties of what kids are wrestling with, how they shift over time. In the United States, we have this Common Core curriculum, and it gives standards by grade level. But the fact of the matter is, beyond phonological awareness and decoding, the sequence of the skills don't make sense because they're really all the same, right? But what changes is that the demands of text change, the demands of task change, and particularly as we get into the older grades in high school, reading in disciplines which involve very specific kinds of skill sets. So we need to teach both generic strategies, discipline-specific strategies, domain knowledge, and dispositions. There are important social and emotional demands of reading comprehension. One has to do with the idea of wrestling with uncertainty and complexity, because when you're reading a text, whether you're in kindergarten or 12th grade, you cannot know ahead of time what the demands of that text are going to be. You can't know ahead of time, even if the teacher tells you, you really don't know. You're making sense as you're reading from one little sentence to the next sentence, from one paragraph to the next, and it's like a big, complex jigsaw puzzle that you're trying to figure out. And the social emotional demands of wrestling with uncertainty and complexity are ones that you have to teach kids how to wrestle with. Wrestling with competing demands. Quite often their kids, particularly in classroom settings, have multiple demands that they're trying to wrestle with as they're reading. Again, the perceptions of your ability to do this work, what it is you're being asked to do, etc., and of the setting itself. So how the social organization of the classroom. Cognitive demands, again, constructing, testing, and revising as we read. There is a tendency, certainly in classrooms in the United States, particularly in sort of middle grades up forward, is to ask kids to read stuff and then ask them questions after they've finished reading, when the process of meaning making has been going on as they're reading. And if you don't have a pedagogical strategy for tackling into what they're doing as they're making sense, sentence by sentence, paragraph to paragraph, when you get to the end and you ask them a question, they don't give you the answer they want, you don't have any idea why. That it involves monitoring and repairing understandings. You think this is what was going on and now something is different, right? How do you integrate what you know with the demands of the text? Is an important part of the planning strategies for how we select and prepare kids for text and the demands of them. So that instruction in terms of doing this integration, necessary integration that we're talking about between social and emotional well-being and the sort of cognitive demands, if you will, about literacy, I would argue from a pedagogical standpoint should help kids to wrestle with questions like who and what can I become? How do I become the person that I want to be? What makes this really hard for me? And what resources are available to me to engage in this text? And from the understanding that the contributions to how kids learn how to wrestle with these questions come from work within family, come from within peer social networks, come from within how they experience classroom, instruction and supports in the community. I'm going to give, because of time, just one brief example from the study of literature. And again, I've argued that literature is particularly salient for the issues we're talking about, because literature is about interrogating human conundrums and dealing with issues of pathways of resilience, and be able to enter worlds that are different from your own, and thinking in very qualitatively important ways about language. Examples of the ways in which literature invites us to wrestle with the complexities of human development. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, people often look at as a story about this young girl, African-American girl, Pecola, judging herself against a white standard of beauty. But Toni Morrison also takes up her father, Charlie, who has raped her, and tries to help us understand, how do you understand Charlie? as a human being? How do you understand what contributed to him engaging such a horrendous activity? Or native stun in terms of Bigger Thomas, and what brings this man to engaging in the kind of maladaptive coping that he does. Again, that literature in particular can invite students in really wrestling with important social and emotional challenges of life, if you will. We've done a study, this is a longitudinal study, looking at relationships between identity wrestling and learning to engage, in our case, in literary wrestling. And we tried to understand this in a sense, as sort of the pedagogical sister, if you will, to Mary Helen's neuroimaging, right? So we wanted to understand epistemology is a very important dimension of comprehension in this case. This is comprehension of literature, that if kids learn to value the fact that you could have different interpretations of text, that there was something personally meaningful to learn by engaging in literature. So you could think about these as sort of social emotional dimensions of learning to engage with literature, that these were positively associated with the assessments of literary comprehension that we had given. Kids' perceptions about their ability to cope with challenge, because we use texts that engage them to wrestle with questions about how to cope with challenge, were again positively correlated with the ways in which we measured their ability to analyze literature. These were high school students. We knew that perceptions were important, so we gathered data about how students experience the way in which we tried to organize instruction, and again, positive correlations between the outcomes and their belief that ability was malleable, right? So again, perceptions of ability become real important, positively correlated with our outcomes. And in this case, we were working with African-American high school students living in low-income communities, and a positive sense of racial identity, again, was positively correlated with their ability to engage in literary analysis. I want to close out with a final point about another sort of dimension of the importance of literacy and social emotional learning, not only to the individual, but to the society at large. The national, again, this is US centric, so I apologize for our international colleagues, but the National Academy of Education prepared a report called Educating Pacific Reasoning and Discourse. It's available again free on the National Academy website. And the argument essentially that we made was that civic reasoning was essential preparation for, in our case, life in a democracy, and that it had to be supported in all content area classrooms across all of the grades. In the United States, of course, as you all certainly are aware, that we have lots of challenges in the civic domain that are very difficult to deal with, and that addressing those challenges in the US, but you have counterparts in almost any other part of the world, of historical actions in the nation state that don't fit the image that the nation state sort of tries to present for itself. And in the case of the United States, of course, it's the history of enslavement of Africans, the war against indigenous nations, and our complex histories around, particularly around issues around immigration. But it's also in the United States situated in a complex system of decision-making that again is different from other parts of the world, particularly with regard to education, where we have a system of governance that involves how do we manage relationships between the power of the federal government versus local entities in the states, between majority and minority rights and the rights of individuals, all of which suggest that the ability to think in complex and nuanced ways, the ability to think about moral and ethical dimensions of one's decision-making are going to be central to the ability of people to be, through public education, prepared to engage in this complex work, that it involves knowledge, it involves epistemologies around valuing complexities, et cetera. It involves ethics and dispositions to question and to weigh multiple points of view. All of this work is really hard. It's really challenging. There's a whole bunch of emotions that one has to sort of monitor, to understand, to be willing to engage in an emotional complexity, if you will, to reason around these challenges. There are knowledge dimensions to addressing all of these problems. These are certainly in the United States, but in relationship to the COVID, of course, this was certainly worldwide. The ability to interpret the maps and the data displays and understand viral mutations is a really important part of the sort of knowledge dimension. Literacy is a pathway into gaining that knowledge, of being able to do research and understand arguments that are made in the public domain. But that, and in the United States, unfortunately, the problem of gun violence, we had a recent case just the other day of, a mass shooting at a high school. But the way in which we don't have a single way of trying to think about what's the source of this problem and how should we deal with it. But that young people, again, are and have been very active agents in the world in this work. And again, my point is simply that wrestling with these complexities are not only important on a personal, individual level, but are important on a societal level, and if you will, really on a world level. So that do not, as you seek to move forward, try to somehow separate, and I'm sorry I say I got separate misspelled there, it's not good, to separate these out as sort of separate paths of pedagogy, but the way in which they're integrally connected. I'm going to close here. I have another slide that I'm not going to show because I don't have time, I'm sure. But if there's time at some point near the end, I might, of just what discussion might look like that recruits these cultural repertoires, the deep demands and skills, in this case of literary reasoning, organized in the classroom, that socially supports kids in being willing to do that hard work. And with that, I'm going to stop and pass it on to my friend Alessandra.
Thanks so much, Carol. It is a privilege to follow both you and Mary Helen, for sure. I am going to share my screen. All right. Basically, in my portion of today's talk, I'm going to very quickly give some reminders on the sorts of things that are involved in learning to read, although I will go quickly there because I assume that that's familiar to many of the folks attending this call. I want to spend the bulk of our time talking about how SEL and reading can connect and give you some practical strategies and resources for how to do so. And before I dive in, I just want to acknowledge that one of the things that I get from the teachers that I work with the most is, I am fully on the SEL train. I'm convinced by the research. I see the effect that it has on my students. I'm just concerned about time and how I can possibly fit time for SEL into my day, given everything else that I have going on. And I want to acknowledge that and to say that one of the things that I think all of us are trying to do today, and that I'm also going to try to do, is show you how your reading related goals for your students and your social emotional goals for your students can overlap, and where that sweet spot is and how you can leverage both of those things at the same time. So what's involved in learning to read? Throughout this talk, I'm going to make reference to concepts from the Active View of Reading model, which was published by Duke and Cartwright in 2021. What I love about this model is it takes those big picture predictors and contributors that we know about with reading achievement of word recognition and language comprehension, as well as the processes that bridge them, and it unpacks them, which makes it a lot easier for us to see how SEL can map on two different reading processes. And also, and this is really big for SEL, it posits that active self-regulation is a kind of an important precursor to all of those things that go on as we learn to read, including motivation and engagement, executive function, and strategy skills. And we've heard a little bit about all of those things from both of our previous speakers tonight. You'll also see that this model focuses on the reader, and it does acknowledge the role of the text, the task, and the sociocultural context that both of our speakers, but especially Dr. Lee, referenced earlier. So we'll see that come up a little bit again later in my talk. So to go through this, I'm going to ground you in a scenario. We've got a second grader named Maya. She's reading a science text about how light travels, important science standard for second grade. And she's reading the sentence, light brightens as you move closer to it and dims as you get further away. So I'm going to unpack a little bit what's going on with Maya as she reads this sentence. Before we get into that, I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of things that had to happen before Maya got to second grade to kind of prepare her for this experience, right? She had to develop a whole bunch of emergent literacy skills and capacities. She participated in a variety of different literacy events and practices in her family, in her community, in school prior to this, in out-of-school settings prior to this. So she's drawing and building on a lot of different things as she goes to try to read this sentence. But let's go into it. So she's reading this sentence at the word level. Let's say she's focusing particularly on the word brightens. She's got to both identify the letters in the word brightens and match those to sounds automatically and fluently, like recognizing that IGH pattern in the sound that it makes. And she's got to be able to switch between considering those relationships and considering meaning, which is called graphophonological semantic cognitive flexibility, right? So she might pay attention to the fact that it ends in ENS and noticing that that ending changes the adjective bright into a verb that means to become brighter, right? So she's doing all of that just focusing on that one word. At the sentence level, she's got to recognize how the parts of the sentence work together and what that tells her about the relationship between the ideas in the sentence. So if she thinks about the sentence as a whole, especially how it's set up with this comma and the conjunction and, she might realize that brightens and dims are opposites, that they mean two opposite things. And at the text level, she's got to draw on the background knowledge and existing vocabulary, as well as the experiences that she has about light and shadow. Maybe she's played a game of sardines with her friends, right? And has noticed the difference of what it looks like when you're really close to that person that you're about to find and you shine the flashlight right in their face versus casting the beam around the room, trying to find them in the first place. And she's also got to consider how the information from that sentence relates to the entire text. So that she can integrate the new information she's learning with what she already knows. Coordinating all of that stuff requires that active self-regulation piece that I told you was going to be really important. So first off, she's got to figure out whether she wants to read this thing about how light travels in the first place. Does she want to read it? Why or why not? And how is reading it going to help her achieve her goals? That's that motivation and engagement piece. She's got to be able to maintain her attention. She's got to be able to hold information in her working memory. So by the time she gets to the end of a sentence or a paragraph, she hasn't forgotten what happened before. And she's got to be able to plan ahead for what's next. And that's those executive functioning skills. And she's got to be able to both notice whether she's comprehending what she's reading and whether she's reading it accurately, and know what to do to fix it up if she notices that she's not. And that is that strategy use piece. So there is a whole lot that goes on just to read that one sentence in that one situation, right? But as my colleagues who preceded me have already told us, reading doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? I just told you about a lot of things that might be going on inside Maya's head, but that's only one tiny piece of the picture. We have to think about what's going on around her as well. So if we ground that situation, if we open up our mental pictures and we see that Maya is sitting in a circle of her classmates, and her teacher is having them read this passage about light and shadow round robin style, we might get a window into what that means. Right now, when I teach my undergraduates about reading fluency and I mention round robin reading, I routinely get from them, oh my gosh, you mentioned that thing and my stomach dropped and my palms started getting sweaty and I started getting nervous because that experience of waiting until it's your turn to read and rehearsing your sentence ahead of time and not listening to anything anybody else is reading because you're so nervous about what's going to happen when it gets to you is so deeply ingrained in many of us that it's become this like cemented emotional experience, right? So if she's in that kind of a context and dealing with those emotions and those physiological responses, she's going to have a different experience than if she's in a highly supportive context with a smaller group where she feels calm and confident and ready to read that sentence. So basically, as I turn into how SEL and reading connect, I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to show you the SEL framework that Lakeisha brought up earlier, particularly because I'm going to be referencing each of these 5 core competencies. And I'll go through them and I'll define each one as I go. But just a heads up that we're going there. I'm going to define each competency. I'm going to connect it to a part of the active view of reading model that I displayed earlier. And I'm going to explain how developing that SEL competency can do some really powerful things for young readers. Like what questions in the mind of a young reader could developing that competency help them to answer? So let's start off with our first of our 5 competencies of self-awareness. So basically what self-awareness is from an SEL perspective, it's the ability to understand your emotions, to understand your thoughts and your values and how they influence your behavior in different kinds of situations. So if we can develop self-awareness skills in our young readers, that's going to connect to the active self-regulation piece of that active view of reading model. If we can develop self-awareness, our readers will better be able to answer questions like, what are my personal strengths and areas for growth as a reader? Can I be successful or at least learn to be successful at the reading task that's been set in front of me? It can help them with that metacognition piece of recognizing, is this making sense to me, right? You have to have a certain level of self-awareness to be able to do that. In a writing situation, it might help them recognize whether the message that they're writing is communicating their intended purpose or not, right? Or if the reading that they're doing is fitting their goals. The second competency is self-management. So that is the ability to manage your emotions, manage your thoughts and behaviors in different kind of situations so that you can be better able to achieve your goals and aspirations. If we can support our students' self-management skills and help them build a toolbox in order to do that, again, we're connecting back to that self-regulation piece. We will have students that are better able to figure out what to do when they don't understand what they're reading or their writing isn't communicating what they want. And they'll be better be able to manage whatever feelings might come up during the reading process. Those might range from everything from wonder and astonishment at something really cool I just read in this science text, or feeling empathy with a character and crying at the end of a really powerful book. There's so many emotions that come up during reading of all kinds of texts, both literature and informational. And we can also help them better manage the emotions that might come up in various school-related literacy situations, including assessments, right, which can be very stressful experiences for a lot of our young readers. Teaching self-management can also help students learn to persevere when stuff gets tough, when reading gets challenging, when comprehension breaks down, or they're really struggling to figure out that one word. If they are able to self-manage, they're going to be better able to do that. Our third competency is social awareness, which is the ability to understand the perspectives of other people. It's that empathy piece, right? Including with people from contexts and experiences and backgrounds that are different from your own. This is going to connect primarily to that cultural and other content knowledge piece of the active view of reading model. And not everything that I'm going to be talking about to you in this piece is directly connected to the model because, as I said at the beginning, that really focuses on the reader more so than the context surrounding the reader. As Carol mentioned, literature is a fabulous way to explore aspects of the human experience. So developing students' social awareness will enable them to do that better, essentially. It's going to help them develop those perspective-taking skills that we all know are really important to understanding literature. We need to be able to put ourselves in the character's shoes to understand their motivations in order to understand what might happen next. Reading can also be a really powerful way for students to safely explore challenging, controversial life topics in a way that is developmentally appropriate and safe. Developing students' social awareness can also help them figure out how reading fits into their own lives and to the lives of others and to their communities. It can help them figure out how they understand the world, how that might be similar to or different from how others understand the world, and how they can learn from other people's perspectives. And then finally, with relationship skills, which are pretty self-explanatory, the ability to establish and maintain healthy relationships. If we can teach students relationship skills, they'll be better able to read and write and participate in literacy activities together with others, and to communicate to others and put their message across. With responsible decision-making, which is our fifth and final competency, the ability to make caring and constructive choices about our own behavior and social interactions across various situations. That's going to, again, connect back to that active self-regulation piece. If we can develop students' responsible decision-making skills, they'll be better able to identify what goals that they have for reading and writing, and to figure out what steps they need to take to achieve those goals. And that might look very different depending on the student, depending on their age, etc. A kid might have a goal to read 10 books about sharks, or to read their very first chapter book ever, or to read all of these things about this issue that they care about so they can construct an argument and present it to a stakeholder. Many different goals that students might have. So given that all the SEL competencies have this potential to positively influence different aspects of students' reading experience, what can we do as educators to leverage those connections? So one of my primary recommendations for you is that you spend a lot of time reading aloud to and with children, and that you are careful about your book choices when you do that. Choose books that allow for these connections to come into play. So books that allow for students to explore feelings, interpersonal relationships, questions of justice and fairness, for them to engage in problem solving. Ask questions as you read. I think Carol mentioned that, right? Don't wait till the end. Ask while you read, to encourage children to consider characters' feelings, their motivations, what they would do in the character's shoes, whether they agree with the character's actions or not. And involve children in discussions about how characters' lives are similar to and different from their own. And these are a few of my recommendations, my personal picture book recommendations for books that I think do this really well. The second thing that you can do as educators is to be really intentional to encourage reading motivation. You can do that by providing choice of whatever you can, whenever you can, right? So choices of what to read, choices of where to read it, choices of who to read it with, wherever it's possible. And that doesn't have to be a free-for-all. It can be from a set of options that you select, right? It can be constrained choice, and it can still be very powerful. You want to give kids opportunities to collaborate because, as my colleagues have already mentioned, reading is inherently social. So you want to give them lots of opportunities to read and talk together about what they're reading. That could look like literature circles. It could look like book clubs. It could look like setting up a routine where students give book talks to each other about what they've read recently and who they think it might be good for. And you also want to give them lots of opportunities to read to answer questions of interest. How enable kids to follow their passions through reading. So you want to design projects and assignments that allow kids to develop their own expertise in something that they care about. You can also help kids develop those executive functioning skills by giving them lots of opportunities to get into a flow state. You know, this kind of place where you can, everything kind of disappears around you. Someone could offer you $1 million, the building could fall down, and you're still going to keep working on that thing. And that doesn't need to be reading related. So you want to find opportunities for kids to have sustained periods of attention wherever it is possible in your instructional day. You want to teach strategies for identifying and managing emotions. If you're in a district that's fortunate enough to have time for an SEL curriculum, your curriculum is going to help you do this. They all do it, all right? But even if you don't, you can do things like teach kids to regularly check in with their bodies and identify what it is that they're feeling in their bodies, what sensations they're experiencing, and help them map that onto an emotion. Another tool that I recommend from a curriculum called Ruler is a mood meter that plots different emotions on 4 quadrants and kind of helps kids get more specific in naming those emotions so that they move beyond just happy, mad, sad. And then finally, you can help kids learn to break down tasks and goals into manageable parts using things like planning organizers, setting check-ins with individual students to both set and monitor progress on goals, and help them learn to pivot when they need to in progressing towards whatever goals they've identified. All right, that's all I've got time for. My email address is there if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Mary Helen. I hope you all enjoyed the presentations as much as I did. My goodness, absolute powerhouses. Mary Helen, it was so incredibly amazing to watch you demonstrate how thinking and feeling are 2 sides of the same coin through this beautiful painting. And Dr. Lee, how amazing. Every single time I hear you all speak, I get to learn more and more from you, you know, how you really educated us on how perception and cognition and emotions, that they're always interacting together. And then you gave us all the characteristics of how to create this robust learning environment. And Alessandra taking us through how the social emotional learning competencies influence literacy development. So thank you all so much for this incredible wealth of knowledge that I hope the practitioners on the call take back with them into their daily lives and into their classrooms. And so want to take the time to answer a few of the questions that we have in the chat. But what first love to begin the conversation with you, Mary Helen, just around how thinking and feeling are opposite sides of the same coin. We still have an issue with the perception of how social and emotional learning is separate from learning. And I'm hoping you can share so that practitioners can take back with them what can we say to disentangle, to address this false dichotomy that continues to exist between learning and academic learning, therefore reading, and social emotional learning?
Yeah, I know that's a great question, Lakeisha. I mean, I think one way to think about this is that, you know, what's the origin of that distinction, right? Of that, it's from the scientists themselves, because we are trained, and this is very beneficial. This works well, right? We are trained that when we want to understand something complex, we should pull apart its pieces. We should examine those pieces as mechanisms. We should look at how those pieces operate. But then we often forget that the pieces don't exist as things. They're part of a bigger thing. They are just what we were able to create as an idea by trying to, you know, take apart something that in lived experience is complex, is dynamic, right? So we can start to focus on an aspect of it, we focus on another, and we can learn a lot that way, right? And it's actually essential to be able to understand things like literacy, right? Like the origins of problems with literacy might be in phonological decoding, or they might be in, so right, they put in executive functioning, or the ways in which kids are regulating themselves, as we just heard from Dr. Ward. There's many ways it could come together, but in a real child, that doesn't mean that those things are sitting there as separate things. They're actually all dimensions of one thing. So when we take the scientific approach of pulling things apart, and this is my title, right? The Frankenstein monster. How do we get past the idea that we then stitch those back together, and that monster we create with all our constructs, isn't a real child, right? Real children aren't all the pieces together. They are the child, and we can pull out dimensions and pieces if we want. It's like shining different colors of light on the person, right? Another way to think about this is to ask yourself, if you think about it this way, whatever people are having emotion about in a context, which you always are, if you're not dead, you're having an emotion about something. It may not be an overwhelmingly strong one, but you have, right, there is some subjective perception of meaningfulness, and right. So whatever you're having an emotion about, is what people are thinking about. Whatever they're thinking about, they could be learning about. So we ask ourselves the question, what are the people in this space, the children learning to read, the teachers interacting with those children, what are they having emotion about? Because that is where their mind is at. So if we think about how do we design literacy curricula and pedagogies that help kids and their teachers have emotions about the ideas that are in the space of literacy, this is basically exactly what the other two speakers were talking about, right? How do we design contexts that those are what the emotions are about? Because when we do that, you have a chance of learning something from the experience that pertains to literacy.
Thank you so much for that, Mary Helen. And Carol, I would be remiss, I just have to bring you into this conversation as well to layer on here, because, Mary Helen just explained, how we can, begin to better design learning, to really incorporate all of these different layers to better support student learning. But I'm hoping, Carol, you can help us, really think about how we can reimagine like our current infrastructure of learning, like learning and SEL, like it's completely separate. So how can we, what are some examples or maybe just practical ways in which we can begin to really move away from learning and SEL as being separate enterprises?
Well, I was thinking as Mary Helen was talking, I gave a talk at American Educational Research Association last year that I titled From a Grandma's Lens, where I argued that my new tool for data collection is my cell phone, looking at my little grandchildren. I have grown grandchildren, little grandchildren, look at the little grandchildren. Because I think that what we're talking about in descriptive language sounds so complicated that it's difficult for people to wrap their heads around it, except that we live it every day. And I think being able, and so the translation, I think in some sense for this in the context of teaching is that schools need to be organized as learning communities, similar to as you have like lesson study in Japan, where teachers in collaboration actually with parents and community members are actually studying practice and engaging with children in terms of their understanding of what they are experiencing. I was meeting with a colleague of mine this summer, talking to her two sons, and the older one, who was probably 11, 12 years old, was diagnosing his teacher's emotions. And I know the teacher, but I think he was pretty right about but the ability to understand in instances of challenge and in instances of positive learning, what all appears to be, going on. And creating case studies in your school, in your community of teachers, because being able to diagnose what we're talking about requires deep expertise. It requires not only deep expertise of understanding how emotions are deployed and engaged and shift over time in the experiences that kids have, in this case with text, but it equally involves, we don't want to lose the cognitive side of the social emotional work about how do we understand the demands of the text that kids are reading, right? And as I had indicated earlier, one of the problems in the field is there are few, if any, tools that are available to teachers to examine the sources of complexity. In the United States, and I think in much of the Western world, certainly in the English-speaking world, they'll use things like Lexiles. And you can go to the Lexile site and put something in it, it'll tell you it's at this grade or that grade. Lexiles are only going to tell you if there's difficult vocabulary and long sentences. The sources of complexity I use as an example is a short story by Alice Walker called Flowers. It's 1 page long. It's about a 4th or 5th grade reading level. Most kids could read the words, but it is very complex, and Lexiles will tell you nothing about the complexity involved. So I guess what I'm fundamentally arguing is both within the teaching profession, what we need are models of teachers deeply studying what are the demands of the text, how do the text meet, social emotional needs of children and of the society in a larger, game. In the United States, this is hard because we're having these wars over who can read what books and that sort of thing. And figuring out how to navigate that, particularly from a policy perspective, I think is also a challenge. But basically, to study learning in real world practice, to study kids as they are engaging in acts of learning how to read. And I will also add that one of the other dichotomies, besides the cognition and the SEL side, is the decoding and the comprehension side. As kids, and I'm sure Alessandra would add to that, even very young children in kindergarten and 1st grade who are learning to read picture books or read books with shorter sentences and the like, are still engaged in deep, complex reasoning that has to be understood and addressed simultaneously if they're going to be engaged and emotionally connected to the text.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Lee. And to build onto this question, there is a question in the chat, and Alessandra, I'm hoping to bring you in for this question, and it's related to a student at the secondary level who is receiving one-on-one some reading interventions and is experiencing a bit of shame through that, and looks at those one-on-one sessions as they're doing something wrong. And so wondering how, what advice would you give to practitioners who might be experiencing some of this might be experiencing this with a student, how to actually work through these emotions that the student is experiencing, and their awareness of what is happening as they're receiving reading interventions to improve their literacy development.
Absolutely. I think that many things could be going on in that adolescent's mind as they experience those emotions. They might be afraid of what they're missing out on in the classroom. They might be afraid of how others are judging them or perceiving them. And I think to acknowledge those and then feed that student's need for connectedness and relatedness. They might be being pulled out for additional supplemental instruction, but that doesn't mean that you can't work as hard as you possibly can to build instructional coherence between what's going on in that room and what's going on in the main classroom. It doesn't mean that you can't work to build opportunities for that student to read socially and to collaborate with others during that time. And it doesn't mean that you can't build opportunities for the student to, sorry, I'm like losing my train of thought right here. to experience relatedness in what they're learning and how it matters to them. You know, Mary Helen just said a minute ago that you want to look for what the student is having emotions about and then think about how they can learn about that thing, right? So here we're having some emotions. We can pursue those as we try to learn more about things. We can look for, maybe we do some reading of literature where characters have experienced situations in which they experience similar emotions and how did they handle that? Or we look for opportunities to build opportunities for that student to learn in that time about something that they deeply, deeply care about, so that it becomes an opportunity for them to engage in something that strikes their interest and in which they want to build expertise.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. I really appreciate. Oh,
Briefly add, because I know we're just about out of time, that another dimension to this that I think comes back to what it means for communities of teachers to really think broadly and deeply about what is determined to be expected practice.
Yeah.
Unless that kid is wrestling with some decoding problems, he or she may not need to be pulled out. So that one of the things that I have talked about in our work is how, particularly high school, you can have kids dealing with a common theme or a common literary problem and read different texts because the skill sets that they're going to need are going to be the same. The skills you model are going to be the same. And it may very well be, and then those communities of kids who are reading different books have opportunities to engage with one another about, the lessons learned about characters, themes, or whatever across those texts. And it may be that we don't have to create that situation that isolates that child and feeling that they have to be pulled out because somehow they're deficit and different.
I was going to just jump on with one other future-oriented thing, something I wrote a little bit in the chat, but something that I think gives heart to practitioners. And we have a new study we're just writing up right now. I was just looking at the data this morning. They're extraordinary. So where we went around all the Los Angeles area and we asked in low SES neighborhoods or in public junior and senior high schools serving low SES neighborhoods with high levels of crime and other things. And we went into the schools and asked the administrators, who are your superstar teachers? Who are the teachers the kids love, they learn from? And so we identified those teachers and we went to them and said, will you do a neuroimaging study with us? Will you let us observe your classroom? Will you let us talk to your kids? Will you do all this stuff? And they were so gracious. 201, they agreed. Anyway, fast forward, that was 40 teachers, took years to do, but what we basically have is this, one of the things we have is this amazing finding, which is so simple, but so poignant. We asked the teachers while they were in our MRI scanner to grade their own students' work. We worked with them to produce an assignment to grade their own students' work. And then they also graded the work that was equivalent of a student they don't know, right? So it's the same answer, but it's a kid they don't know. And we looked at they didn't give different grades. They gave the same grade to the matched student versus the kid they don't know, but the brain activity was massively different. They have social and affective and regulatory and attention-oriented mechanisms all activating in their brain much more when they're grading their own student than when they're grading a kid they don't know. And here's the real kicker. We also asked the teachers to provide feedback to a random selection of students from their class. Here's your student, Alessandra. What would you tell Alessandra about how she's doing when you have a meeting with her, right? And so we took those answers that they gave to 6 students that we randomly chose, and we analyzed those for their social cognitive complexity. To what degree does that teacher try to help the student with instrumental transactional skills and behaviors, and to what degree are they actually understanding and showing appreciation that that student is a whole human being with a range of social contexts and who's on a developmental growth trajectory. They're building courage, they're building confidence, they're using the literature in these ways, not just to decode, right? Are they really thinking about how the work feeds into the development of that person and representing that when they give feedback? The degree to which teachers had that complex social orientation to their students moderated statistically. It explained the difference between the brain activities in the 2 cases. So in other words, the more the brain activity when they're doing their own students, it's due to the fact that they're thinking about these complex human attributes and trying to situate their students' learning and their feedback for that student in a growth trajectory that represents all of who that child is and not just what they did on this assignment. I think that's such a powerful statement about the kind of work that really goes into teaching. Teachers are like, and should be really gratified by these findings. I think it really speaks to the amount of expertise and social and emotional work that teachers bring to their classrooms. And it really speaks to the ways in which we need to support teachers and develop teachers' knowledge. And teachers cannot engage in this kind of work if they're under stress, if they have not enough resources, if they're being judged in ways that keep them from really engaging with who the kids are. So look out for that in some months. It's going to take us a while to get it out published, but follow along and we'll send it to you.
Thank you so much for that, Mary Helen. I think you really kicked off, a discussion. I know that there's a lot of questions, particularly around, recommendations from federal, state to local around how we can better support and improve students' literacy development and the integration of social emotional learning. And so I know we're just a little bit over time, but just want to share a bit of that because Mary Helen began to discuss what we can do to begin to improve teacher preparation and also teacher professional development. And so just wanted to share at the state level, there are very few states that have integrated social emotional learning into their academic standards, but there's 27 states that have adopted social emotional learning standards. And so one of the things that states can do to help support literacy development and integration of SEL is really developing and adopting robust SEL standards. At the district level, what we know that's important, and you heard Dr. Ward really get into this, as well as Dr. Lee and Dr. Immordino-Yang explain to us the adoption of SEL curriculum, as well as reading curricula that's integrated, that really supports both domains, really thinking about what Mary Helen explained to us around thinking and feeling being opposite sides of the same coin. At the federal level, we just saw the White House announce about $140 million investment into evidence-based strategies to support reading development. One of those areas in which they invested in was around comprehensive literacy state development grants. This is where you can really leverage these funds to do this integration, to really adopt these evidence-based practices to really support students' reading development. You heard Mary Helen start to get into strengthening teacher preparation as well as professional development. We can also invest in a robust research infrastructure so that we can better understand literacy development and the complexities, as Dr. Lee was explaining to us, being able to help our teachers really understand the demands of text and what that involves and how their learning can better support learning development. So that brings us to the conclusion of our program. It's about 6:38. Thank you all for hanging in here with us through the end of our program. We're out of time. Would love to continue this for another hour, but I just want to again thank Dr. Ward and Dr. Lee and Dr. Immordino-Yang for such a profound conversation. I learned so much every single time I listened to them. So I hope that this was a worthy discussion of your time at the end of your day. I hope you learned so much from them. I also want to thank ILA for the opportunity for this platform to have this discussion. We're so grateful to them for their time and this opportunity. As a reminder, you will be receiving the article that Dr. Lee and Dr. Ward authored, the role of SEL in enhancing literacy development. So we look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you so much for your time, for joining us and listening with us and sharing your questions this evening. As a reminder, 5 days from now, there will be a closed caption recording of this event that will be available on literacyworldwide.org/digital events. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.